Social sustainability is all about creating formal and informal processes, systems, and structures that support healthy and livable communities. It's about providing the necessary framework to what the vulnerable members of the society can live in dignity and fulfill their potential. Of course, social sustainability contains some dilemmas and some political aspects. For instance, when it comes down to the questions of what is wants and what is needs in life, then it becomes clear that we in the social field cannot do it all alone. There is a vital need to integrate the physical and social design of communities if we are to create communities that are both environmentally and socially sustainable. Collaboration with other public services is, in other words, necessary, and in Copenhagen we are fully aware of that. Our strategies are to a large extent collaboration and coordination with different administrations in order to make the best out of it for the benefit of the citizens. We will now continue with the theme strategies for sustainability at either end of life. We had it in this morning and we have it again either end of life course with a focus on, first of all, children's services through the case of Ireland, care for older people based on the recent OECD report, Help Wanted, and finally we conclude with a talk about how Denmark is investing in welfare technology. There will be time afterwards to ask questions to the three speakers after they have all given their speeches. So please hold your questions to all three. We have been through all three prominent speakers. We are lucky to have you three very prominent speakers here giving their views on the theme today. We have Frances Fitzgerald, who is Minister of Cabinet for Children and Youth Affairs in Ireland. We have Fritz Chardens, who is CEO of HASCA, which is an abbreviation for Health and Social Care Associates. And we have Anders Lynge Madsen, who is Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Social Affairs and Integration in Denmark. First of all, a very warm welcome to Ireland's first ever Cabinet Minister of Cabinet for Children and Youth Welfare, Frances Fitzgerald, about ensuring the safety and welfare of children and young people into the future. Before you were appointed as Minister, Mrs. Fitzgerald trained as a social worker and family therapist and has worked with inner city communities in London and Dublin. We are looking very much forward to listening to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Annette. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to the European Social Network for me to speak here this afternoon. I'm extremely interested in the topics being discussed, and the whole issue of sustainable public services, as you can imagine, is a very critical issue for us in Ireland. You will be aware that we've come from a situation of huge economic prosperity, the years as they were described of the Celtic Tiger, to a situation where we're a country in a programme with huge problems in relation to debt management, which has very big implications for the kind of issues we're discussing here today. And there's very critical debates taking place at the moment. And I suppose one of the things that strikes me as somebody with a background in social policy is how economically focused the debates often are. We have very intense discussions, as I'm sure you do in other European countries, about the Eurozone at present, about where we're heading, about the possible solutions. But the resultant impact on social policy, on services, does not get quite the level of debate that the economic solutions get, nor is the integration of the two, the economic and social. I don't believe that the debate is at the level that it needs to be at, because clearly there are such implications for the very services we're speaking about here today, with the kind of economic challenge that we are facing, the economic challenges at national and European level. The debate in our country does tend to get focused on issues called austerity or cutbacks, and tends sometimes, I think, to be presented somewhat simplistically in terms of the funding choices. And it's quite clear we need a debate that's a more integrated debate and which really outlines the kind of challenges that we do face in terms of sustaining the type of services and what kind of services going forward, given the huge investment there has been, for example, in Ireland in these services. Many of these services now are facing concern about their future or asking where to. And some of these questions, I have to say, at a political level are quite difficult to answer. So it's very important that we have this type of debate, I believe, at national and European level. It's quite clear that we live in very troubled times. Globally, the world economy faces enormous challenges. And here in Europe, certainly in Ireland, the requirement to rein in the growth of public debt has gone from being desirable to vital if we are to finance our public services into the middle and longer term. And as I say, much of the debate does centre around austerity, but in most cases, however hard we try, we continue to spend often more than we raise in taxes. So it is an increasing challenge to meet the needs of our most vulnerable, of all our people, but particularly our most vulnerable. It's quite clear that business as usual, spending less but without reform, will inevitably result in more people, particularly children, entering poverty. It will also result in poorer health and social services being delivered. In some cases, I do believe it could result in lives being lost. I don't believe that business as usual is an option. And that is why we do have to reform how we deliver our services, how we do business as a state, how we set priorities. And we have to ensure that in the challenges facing us, the vulnerable in our society do not suffer even more. Certainly there's some very worrying signs in relation to many of the statistics. You heard earlier of the figures in relation to needs, not those young people not in employment, education and training. We have very serious problems in relation to this group of young people. What's very clear is that we need to invest in this area. It will save money, but there is quite a job to be done at a public level in convincing people of this and of the priorities. I chaired a meeting just before I came about early intervention in Ireland, and while it's absolutely clear what the economic benefits of early intervention are, to actually sell in early intervention at this time when public finances are so critical is extremely difficult, however desirable that it is. So I would like to take a few minutes to outline to you some of the ways we're approaching a reform in relation to children and young people in Ireland at present, and give you some pen pictures of the different areas that we are challenging and some of the ways we have highlighted the need for reform. Obviously, creating a Department of Children and Youth Affairs was a first step and a new ministry. In many ways, this arose out of what has been a very poor history in relation to child protection. We've had over 17 reports outlining how services have failed young people. We consider ourselves a very family-oriented society in Ireland, very child-centred. But when you examine some of the evidence of institutional care and child abuse, that evidence can be quite disquieting. Just last week, I published a report of the deaths of children in care. We didn't have an independent review mechanism. Many of your countries do have that mechanism, but we didn't have it until recent years. And we published a report of 10 years of experiences of the most vulnerable in the care system, those who lost their lives. It's very striking to look at the kind of information which emerged, and it may indeed find an echo for some of you. It highlighted very specifically the lack of interagency working with the most complex cases and the impact of services. Many services involved, but very often the impact not being quite what it should be. Many other lessons as well, but I think at the heart of it a need for strong evaluation of what we're actually doing. Many services have developed in an ad hoc manner. When there was a lot of money, they got the money, and outcomes perhaps were not focused on as they needed to be. So really at a national level, one of the things we're doing in order to change this approach to children and young people is we're looking at a deeper commitment in our constitution to children's rights. And we're having a referendum later this year to amend the constitution. Speaking in those of you from the Nordic countries, perhaps may not relate to this in quite the same way, because you perhaps have a different model in relation to children's rights already well established. But in terms of a country where family was certainly very centre, this focus on individual rights within the family is not embedded in our constitution, and that's what we intend to do later this year. So to strengthen children's rights, to give at constitutional level expression to recognising the voice of the child. Of course, we have an ombudsman and we have many institutions that do recognise the voice of the child and in practice do listen, do hear, but at constitutional level it's not reflected. So we want to reflect that at constitutional level, and also the best interests of the child. And that would be a very interesting debate, because many it's often referred to in the United States as cultural wars. But in fact, I think this will be a very interesting debate, and we certainly hope we'll get the support to ensure that this referendum will be passed later this year. We're also doing a new children and young people's policy framework, so that at national level we have a clear articulation of national policies for children and young people. And we're doing a lot of asking people for online submissions. We've done research with 68,000 children, a very large survey of what young Irish children want. We've had the schools cooperating with that, giving us feedback on the views of young people. And that is a new framework to ensure we have the kind of integration that has been missing. So we will outline the desirable outcomes for our children, a national vision, if you like, in that policy, and we'll have many people involved in developing the policy in the course of the year, and much consultation with those who work with children and with the public. One of the initiatives we're taking, and I know the way children's services are organised varies around Europe, but one of the initiatives we're taking at present is we want to improve the quality and consistency of child protection and child welfare services. And what we're doing is we are removing child and family services and the early intervention and family support services from a larger organisation of the health services where they were lost. And there is much reform going on at the moment in relation to our health services, but what we have decided to do is separate out, but of course there'll be very important links maintained and essential in providing services to young people. But we are establishing what we're calling a new child and family support agency, which will be the key agency delivering services. It's not just about changing the name, obviously, it's about doing things in a different way, and also establishing clearer management structures. We've had a lot of local and regional management, and while that has an important element in terms of developing national policy, we really have been stuck by not having enough national data about what's happening around the country. So that agency will assume statutory responsibility for services for children and families in 2013. And of course, a big priority there will be what I've mentioned already, the focus on interagency work, getting the very best out of those who work with children, the different agencies. It's very clear from international research that interagency work is critical. But of course, what is said again and again, it's not about just doing interagency work, it's how you do it and how you deliver it to the children and families, and how you ensure that the services are there for the children and families, and that the child and the family are those at the centre, not the services. And certainly my recent report would suggest that professional barriers are a problem in delivering services, and professional organisation is a barrier as opposed to a help in delivering the kind of services that many of those most at risk need. We're establishing local children's services committees in each county, so that you will have somebody responsible for bringing all of the services together at a local level, all organisations working locally. And certainly when I've attended some of these meetings, I've been extremely struck by the variety and intensity of services, but the lack of connection to one another. And these new children's services structures at county level are a very important way forward in terms of bringing the services together and sharing information, sharing knowledge, and working effectively. We're also at national level changing the way we handle child protection. We had a voluntary code of behaviour, if you like, in relation to reporting abuse. We're making it mandatory now. There's a lot of debate in relation to this internationally as to whether it should be mandatory or voluntary, but we have decided, because of our history and the kind of ambivalences we've had in this area, that we will make it obligatory for certain professional groups and for certain organisations working with children. We are putting into legislation how they will report those concerns and how they will share information and work together. And we've had a very interesting series of consultations with our national sporting organisations, our national teacher organisations, our national medical organisations. And in having the consultation, we believe there's a new awareness developing amongst those groups about child protection and what they need to be doing in their own professional lives in relation to this issue. So it is a way of making child protection everyone's responsibility. And the indications are very positive from the feedback that we've got to date. I've mentioned early intervention and the challenges around communicating the terrific research, really, we have on early intervention, but the challenges of ensuring at a time of austerity and of cutbacks that the early intervention services, which after all are very often, of course, they're about current needs, but they also give very long-term benefits. But it is, as I said, very challenging to ensure continued investment in those areas at present. We do have a 14% unemployment rate at the moment, so obviously the best way forward is the creation of jobs. It was asked this morning, where are the jobs going to come from? I think we're still needing to really answer that question. In Europe, it's very challenging. We certainly have made ourselves more competitive. We've taken a lot of initiatives in relation to jobs activation and creation of jobs, and certainly working in international investment. There's a whole range of issues. We certainly want to give out the message, and it's very true that Ireland is open for business, but clearly it is a very tough environment. But creating those jobs is essential for those young people, the needs. It's essential for the many other people who've become unemployed in Ireland. And the activation measures around jobs and education are receiving a huge priority, as indeed is continuing to sustain childcare. We don't have a comprehensive model of childcare in Ireland. We have one free preschool year, and we have services for disadvantaged communities and quite considerable investment. But again, I would say, as Minister for Children and Youth Affairs at this point in time, clearly there are huge political pressures in maintaining the range of services that probably most people in this room would want to see being maintained at this time. And clearly they would pay economic benefits as well as social benefits. But we have very significant budget decisions to make this year, taking 3.5 billion out of our economy, and the same again next year. And unless we get the kind of growth that's needed in Europe and needed in all our countries, these decisions will continue to be very challenging. I do believe, in terms of moving forward, ensuring that the voices and the participation of young people is central is very critical. And we have developed very interesting initiatives throughout the country and at national level in relation to the participation of young people. We are creating more and more opportunities to ensure, whether it's in the local councils, where we have groups of young people going along, meeting county managers, meeting local authorities, discussing their priorities. We're seeing very creative initiatives coming from young people when they are given the opportunity at a structural level to participate and be involved. And some of the most interesting initiatives I've seen are coming from young people, for example, in relation to mental health and the way they are initiating reforms in that area, in their schools, in their local communities, dealing with a whole range of issues. We're seeing a huge innovation coming from young people throughout the country, and I think it is one of the most interesting areas where we're seeing creative solutions to problems. And obviously all our work is based on the belief that children and young people are not the adults of tomorrow, but the citizens of today. I hope that my very brief overview of some of the initiatives I'm taking will give you an idea of some of the challenges that we're facing at this really very challenging time. It is critical that we discuss reform, that we discuss the evaluation of the services that have grown up, and mainstream some of the learning from the pilot projects. We've had a lot of pilot projects, and we really have to move from pilot projects to the integration of the lessons from those projects to national level. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm delighted that the topic is receiving the kind of attention it is during the course of this conference. Thank you very much indeed. We've had, for example, a big investment in Dublin in 3 different areas. We would consider it a big investment. It's 15 million from the government, 15 million from a philanthropic organisation. And we now have the results coming in of a variety of interventions in local communities, with preschoolers, with teenagers, with young families, with lone parents. And the results are coming in from those projects. And the challenge really is what you've outlined. It's how do you take the results? And some of the services haven't worked. So I think it's very important to evaluate. We have some projects that did not give good results and should be discontinued. We've had projects that worked. And what we want to do and what we are doing with those is we have to see how these results translate into some of the universal services that we have. I think that's really important, so that, for example, when we see what's happening with the pilot projects in childcare, let's say, or after school, we do have a universal 1 year, as it happens, and many, many other services for in disadvantaged communities. I think it's practice. It's about quality and standards. It's not all about extra resources. And it is about shared learning. So it is about that sharing of the results at a practice level with the professionals and with those who are developing the service. I think at a policy level, it's about government saying this is what we're going to do in certain areas as opposed to something else. And I think it's also looking at where the money is going, because as I say, a lot of the money, when you have a lot of money, and I don't know whether this applies in the Nordic countries or whether you've had a more policy-led approach you may have, but when funding is given in an ad hoc way, services, develop in a variety of ways. So we're now going to have to look at where the money has been put, and there is going to be reallocations, and there has to be. And I think we have to look at different funding streams, perhaps, reorganisation of funding streams and reform in how we deliver if you take the youth services. And perhaps at national level, a clearer outlining of priorities. So that, in fact, when we're funding many of the voluntary organisations, perhaps we need more, and I do believe we need more alignment between national priorities and where the money is going. And that's difficult because you're talking about value for money in the voluntary sector as well as the government sector and trying to align the two.
How do we combine and learn from each other? You have shown us a lot of figures here, but how do we combine and learn from each other with the different traditions and cultures that the countries have? We have very different traditions. What are you thinking about? What could we do to learn from each other?
But there's a lot of knowledge around, flying around, and there's not much dissemination going on. And sometimes there's implementation, but what is often lacking is second stage implementation. That's not sexy. As a politician, you want to do something new. You don't want to continue what your predecessor did, even when it was good. Sorry. But it is the case. You want to develop new stuff. Sometimes you're forced, or sometimes it's a really good idea. But sometimes there's also lots of knowledge and opportunities waiting on a plank, or it's actually there, but it should have continued funding, and then there's only project funding available where implementation then is lacking. There's so much flying around that we could use. The only problem is who's going to get it together.
What's your advice to our European colleagues? You have maybe said some of it, but what is your advice to the other countries?
Well, I don't know whether we know how to do it.
No.
Well, I think what we have experienced is that there are really something to gain viewing into the area between the public sector and the private sector as to developing technology. And I think it is important to be aware that local authorities who in many countries are responsible for care don't have the power themselves to go into this kind of cooperation. It requires money, but it also requires some some power to meet industries at an equal level. So my advice will be do something. It might be at a national level, but it can also be cooperation between different authorities or municipalities. But try to gain what can be gained from discovering the area between public and private sector.
Yeah, you have a small question?
The first question is, obviously, what you said is very important. How much money are you hoping to save as a result of using IT for especially older people's care? That's the first question. The second one is, since you have developing these ICT equipments, are these equipments, and I assume that you're taking a lead role in the world, so would they be able to sort of send to other countries, for example?
Well, we haven't the figures about how much we do save, but the purpose is, of course, to save money. But mainly it is to meet the challenge of the lack of people working in the area, which we will meet within some years. About being leading in the world about technology, that would be very nice, but I don't think it's realistic. But we will do it if we can.
Clearly, I mean, there's huge philosophical questions at present in relation to the various balances, and I mean, I think perhaps the environmental agenda is certainly from where I see it, is coming under more pressure, given the immediate demands. But I think the presentation we heard earlier this morning shows how it has to go hand in hand, and in fact may contribute to the kind of efficiencies and savings we're talking about.
I might be prejudiced. I'm from the Netherlands. This century we will experience a rise in sea level of 45 centimeters or something, which means that half of our country will flood. So is social action relevant? Yes, of course. Absolutely.
That was short. Okay, floor is yours.
And I started off by saying that I felt the economic debate, if you like, I mean, it has to be out there, it has to be very strong. Undoubtedly, it's taking huge attention. But I think we're failing to balance it with a critical debate on the very points that you raised in relation to the social and the social policy aspects. And I think in the area of creating jobs, for example, by investment in social services, certainly I haven't heard a strong enough articulation at national or European level in relation to that. And I think it would deal with some of the qualitative issues that you raise. And I think it's really essential, for example, for this audience as professionals working in the area, that we ensure this voice is heard. But it's, you know, traditionally it's a voice that hasn't been heard as strongly as perhaps some of the, you know, the broader economic arguments, and those in the sector perhaps are less well paid. We all know the arguments in this room. But I think it's really essential, and it is one of the ways forward. There's no doubt about that. And I think Fritz's presentation, you know, illustrates that as well.